Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka. I'm the director of the Iran program here at the Middle East Institute in Washington. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event, Climate Change in the Persian Gulf region. This morning's panel is part of a series of panels that we are planning to organize in coming months at the Middle East Institute to look at environmental challenges that are impacting Iran and the Gulf states. Today's panel will mostly focus on challenges that the country of Iran is faced with, but the series as a whole aims to do three things. First, to identify key environmental challenges that Iran is facing and assess Tehran's response. Second, to do the same evaluation about challenges Gulf states are facing and then evaluate their response. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we aim to identify possible ways for scientific exchanges and technical cooperation between Iran and the Gulf states. Not only is such pan-regional cooperation necessary to come up with a collective approach to protect the health of the region, including the Persian Gulf, but environmental cooperation could be a step in creating political goodwill among the regional states and perhaps lead to more cooperation in other fields. Today, I'm pleased to welcome three experts who will discuss and help us understand the environmental challenges faced by Iran and the Persian Gulf region as a whole. I will introduce them in the order they will speak. First, we have Kaveh Madani. Kaveh is an environmental scientist, educator, and activist. He has previously served as the Deputy Vice President of Iran in his position as the Deputy Head of Iran's Department of Environment. He has also served as the Vice President of the United Nations Environment Assembly Bureau and Chief of Iran's Department of Environment's International Affairs and Convention Center. I had to write that down. Next, we have Qena Al-Hanai. Qena, who is originally from the United Arab Emirates, is a civil engineer at the Sani Astani Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Southern California. Among other topics, Qena's research is focused on the issue of rising temperature and the food, energy, water nexus in the Gulf and the environmental impact of the region's heavy dependence on infrastructure like oil rigs, nuclear reactors, and desalination plants. Last but not least, we have David Leyland. David's lifelong experience with Iran includes living there as an Iranian, engaged in wildlife conservation and management for 15 years through the 1979 revolution. From 2006 through 2017, he traveled extensively through rural Iran while engaged in wildlife conservation and US-Iran scientific information exchanges. At present, he is in a graduate school focused on Iran and environmental sciences. All right, and just a quick admin note, to submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching on our live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email also events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel, and I'll be looking forward to questions, and I integrate as many as I can. With all that said, let's start. Kaveh, let me start with you, and I will then turn to Qena and then David. Kaveh, go ahead, please. Give us a big picture of what's going on in terms of the environmental challenges that Iran is faced with. I can't think of many other better people to give us that overview than your good self. So please go ahead.
I wish you were asking me for a positive review of the things happening in the Middle East and Iran. I'm that person who just appears on media and describes I think the black side of everything happening in the environmental sector in Iran. But Iran, like the other countries in the Middle East, is facing a range of environmental problems that have been created by decades of bad management and lack of foresight. A region in the world which is, as we know, rich in oil and gas, has plenty of resources and money, and wanted to catch up with the rest of the world, and got lessons on development from the West, especially I would say, because of the similarities with the US West. It tried to copy a lot of things happening in this side of the world, and the result of that copying without thinking through the programs and what the long-term consequences is what we are seeing today. As we know, the Middle East is drier than the rest of the world. Iran is better, is richer than many of the countries in the Middle East, and when it comes to water resource availability, but water in the region and in Iran has never been seen as a limit to growth. The mentality over there has been that we got the money, we got the talent, we got best engineers and best knowledge, and we have access to the foreigners. We can build and overcome the challenges that we have. We can address this issue. We started with digging wells, getting deeper and deeper, then building dams, then transferring water, desalination, and probably very soon taking water out of air. This has not helped the region solve its problems. Instead, problems have been solved for a short period of time. There has been agricultural development, expansion, creation of jobs, and so many other things. But in the long run, water level has dropped in aquifers. Surface water has dried up in many places. Wetlands have dried up. Then we have desertification. We have deforestation. We have now sand and dust storms more frequent than before. Iran it was experiencing some of that in the east, but not in the west, and that's now a problem that we are facing, many times a year today. Then we have the issue of air pollution. We have the issue of wildfires. We have the issue, anything you name it, Iran has it. And extreme events and climate change and other things are adding to the problem. But let's not forget that the region as a whole has always had issues because of the lack of water, has always had challenges and concerns about its food security. Again, the mentality was that we have money, we can become self-sufficient, we can even become wheat exporters, as Saudi Arabia tried to do it. Iran, because of the revolution, because of the war with Iraq, because of years of sanctions, has a paranoia about its food security and wanted to become food self-sufficient. As a result, we are seeing lots of problems in the environmental sector and the water sector in particular. But besides the food security concern, while oil and gas is the backbone of the economy of the region, we have to remind ourselves that water is essentially, and natural resources in general, are the backbone of the political economy of the region. You create jobs for the poor. You create jobs for the weakest sector of the economy. And as long as your economy is weak, as long as you cannot diversify it and you cannot industrialize your economy and get into the creation of jobs in the service sector, then you just use your natural resources to create jobs. Agricultural sector is the easy sector to create jobs. So that is why Middle Eastern leaders have a hard time decoupling their economy from water and moving away from water. So all the things are water dependent. And because of the lack of water, we are seeing the problems that we are seeing today.
Kaveh, let me just quickly follow up before I turn to Rena. In your experience as someone who not only knows Iran, but the broader region, what would you say the level of understanding is among the political elite in the various countries in terms of, the utility of pulling resources together when necessary to deal with some of these collective challenges? And we'll get to some of the specifics with Rena in a second, but just from a political, bureaucratic, if you will, experience that you've had, what would you say?
I think, in general, I think if we talk about the society, Iran is ahead of the region in terms of being concerned about the environment. So the environmental awareness in Iran is quite high. People continuously talk about the environmental problems, media talks about it, but environment has become another sector in which people express their concerns about the bad management, poor governance, and what the system is doing. This sort of concern has not resulted in a radical reaction or reforms of the things. Now, when it comes to the elites, if you will, if you want to name them, or academics, experts, and so on, I think we have the problem that the rest of the world has. We in environmental science, we keep talking about climate change. We keep talking about environmental problems, waste, so many other things. And the solutions are always easy to us. Like, we impose taxes, change this, change that, don't burn oil and switch to renewables, and you solve the problem. But the reality is that we are dealing with a complex problem. It's compare it to COVID-19. The solution to COVID-19 is easy for those involved in the health sector. Doctors have the easy solutions. They say, shut down, stay at home, and you solve the problem. But those who are not, in the health sector know that if they shut down, everything, shut down businesses, shut down the economy, the consequences would be much worse, actually, in the long run. So then you have the battle between different sectors of your economy. You have battle between the different sectors of your administration, and so on. The same applies to the environmental sector, with the big difference that environment is, unlike COVID-19, the environmental sector and the environmental problems don't have quick victims, so they don't show, they appear in the long run, and the consequences are always long term. And if you react to them, also you see the benefits in the long run. So I think we don't have the correct narratives about the causes of environmental problems in Iran, in the Middle East, and in many other parts of the global South. We are, reductionists. We simplify everything and just say, okay, bad management, poor governance, mismanagement, and go fix the issue, switch to renewables, start importing food, and you solve your problems. No, the problems will not be solved this easy, and you cannot only focus on the environmental sector and solve the problems within the environmental sector. These problems are interrelated. You have, huge uncertainties, a lot of trade-offs, and a lot of dynamics that you have to pay attention to. And unfortunately, our prescriptions won't work unless we can do something about the economy, unless we can do something about, a reform on the direction of the system, and fix the governance system in many parts of the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Anna, turning to you, I just wanted to quote a few data or figures from a article you wrote with the title "Rising Temperatures, Rising Risks: The Food, Energy, Water Nexus in the Persian Gulf." I mean, some of the numbers that you refer to in the article are quite interesting, if not frightening at times. Population growth in the Gulf region has gone up by 30% in 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. 30% increase in population. That's a big number. You have had the dependency, obviously, for not only water, but energy and food security go up accordingly. Mm-hmm. You talk about, as one of the solutions, perhaps, which is something I wanted you to comment on specifically, 45% of the world's desalination is occurring in the Gulf region. 45%. That, again, another big number. Mm-hmm. And other numbers that I found very interesting. There are 800 offshore platforms located in the Persian Gulf, and 50,000 tankers go through the Gulf, and God knows how much oil spillage there is, because the point being, there isn't really much of a dedicated effort to monitor what's going on by the littoral states, which is really what I'm trying to get to. I want you to talk about desalination, what it means, but I also wanted to follow up with you in terms of what is being done by the littoral states, since so much of the world's desalination efforts, which uses a lot of water and energy, is happening in this small plot of land, and Iran increasingly is talking about desalination. So the number of desalination plants will probably continue to go up. But talk about the trend about desalination, and talk about what you think could be done in terms of trying to, as I asked Kaveh earlier, the sort of collective solutions to the issue of protecting the health of this body of water.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll give a quick overview on the Gulf region and the dependencies on this body of water, and I'll focus on desalination and etc. I always like to preface by saying if you are on one side of the water, you refer to this as the Persian Gulf. If you are on the other side, you refer to it as the Arabian Gulf. My PhD advisor is from one side and I'm from the other side. And we have agreed always to just refer to this as the Gulf. So throughout, I'll be referring to the Gulf, and I mean specifically this body of water. So it's surrounded by 8 countries. It is a semi-enclosed body of water with just one small opening to the wider ocean. And it's really a pretty small body of water. To give a perspective on size, it's roughly half the size of the state of California. So it's a really small body of water that these 8 countries heavily depend on for various things. One of the things is food, their seafood consumption. Some of these countries have the highest seafood consumption rates in the world. If we compare to the US is around 6 to 7 kilograms per year, while in the Gulf, some of the countries are nearly 30 kilograms per year. So they really depend on this body of water for seafood consumption. And then, of course, desalination. They really don't have any other option when it comes to potable water. The option that they have is getting water from the Gulf and desalinating this water. And of course, with the quick boom in population growth, this has become increasingly and increasingly more urgent. And this number, actually, the 45% number that you mentioned, has quickly grown and is estimated to be somewhere now closer to 60% of the world's desalination capacity in this body of water. Some of the things that make this body of water critical is a dependency on, of course, we have oil and gas activities that are very high in this region. And then we have desalination activities, which really are interconnected because you need the power to be able to operate the desalination plants. And of course, you need water to be able to operate these plants. They work hand in hand. They're very interconnected. And we now have this trend towards nuclear power to be able to diversify the energy supply in the region and to meet the future demand as population grows and grows very quickly. And so as of a few months ago, we now have 2 nuclear reactors operating in the region. And UAE, for example, has 3 more planned. Iran has a couple more planned. Saudi Arabia is considering up to 16 reactors. So this number could potentially in the next decade or two be as many as 30 reactors operating in the region, which adds another challenge because now you have oil and gas in this small body of water, you have the desalination activities trying to secure clean water, and you now have the introduction of nuclear power, which again, they're all interconnected. Whatever one of these industries puts into the water can threaten the other 2 industries. So it's becoming much more critical to really protect this body of water. And one point of data that is very critical is that most of these countries only have a 2 to 3 day storage supply of water in the case of an emergency. So if they weren't able to have their desalination plants functioning or operating at the extent that they're operating now, they only have a 2 to 3 day storage supply. This is something that the countries have highlighted and they are trying to work on, but it's still a challenge that they are trying to work on. For example, Abu Dhabi in UAE has built a massive underground storage facility that holds about 6 billion gallons of water. And this is meant to sustain about 1 million people for 3 months in the case of an emergency. Now, UAE has closer to about 10 million people. So if you divide this with 10 million, it becomes much less, maybe a 9 to 10 day supply of water. So it's still a challenge that they're working with and is a concern in the region, especially as now we are adding another critical infrastructure in the region. So that is a quick overview, basically, of the region, and I'll leave it at that as a quick overview.
Before I ask my follow-up question, especially thanks to you for joining us today, because you're calling in from Texas, and I know you are going through a tough time down there with the snow and power issues. So thank you for being flexible and joining us.
Thank you.
You know, the numbers again are quite staggering. All these planned, at least, nuclear power plants that are coming on. And I guess one of the, I mean, there are two ways for me at least, as somebody who's not necessarily a specialist in the environment, but there are two probably reasons why they're doing this in terms of increased number of power plants. One is geopolitical competition. I think the Iranian nuclear program certainly got others interested. And then you have the sort of ticking clock there, that you got all this oil and gas that you want to sell to the world before it becomes useless because technology is going to overtake it. Now, that might be an exaggerated assumption on my part. I don't know how close we are to that post-hydrocarbon era. But my point, though, is this. All that aside, the driving factors aside, you described to us industries that are active in the region. And these are industries that you need to tackle very carefully. I mean, if you don't, something goes wrong, the whole region, not only individual countries, the whole region will pay the price for it. So where are we on that? Where are we from what you see? Do you see any trends in terms of, and I asked Kaveh the same thing, I mean, are there any conversation on a regional level today, 2021? I know these things have happened in the past, but what is the nature of the conversation among the regional states about the collective effort to monitor, to protect if something, God forbid, should go wrong?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges, is getting all the countries at one table, collaborating with a unified effort, unified strategy to plan how to preserve this body of water and also how to react in case an incident happens. What is the plan? Some of these countries are working together to come up with strategies and responses, but again, the challenge is getting all 8 countries right at the table and coming up with a unified plan, because as you said, whatever one country puts in, it immediately impacts all the surrounding countries. And so that is a challenge and a very important next step that we hope to see soon. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Venna. David, let me turn to you. And you are a man who has not just studied Iran, but as an Iranian, you've lived there. You have seen the operations in this sector firsthand. I wanted to ask you, David, if you could give us some insights into. I mean, Kaveh just earlier talked about Iran as a society is very aware of environmental challenges that are facing the countries, and there are hundreds and hundreds of NGOs that Kaveh has told me that operate in this area. So awareness is not an issue, but sometimes you're aware of something and you still need a bit of a help to fix something, and you might want to look to the outside world for the best know-how and transfer of technology and so forth. My question to you, David, is what would you say in terms of if somebody wanted to look for regional cooperation and scientific exchange of data? As of today in the Islamic Republic of Iran, how equipped is the country and how willing is the country to sort of look to neighboring states for, as I said, those possible common solutions to some of these problems?
Alex, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here, especially with Gemma and Kaveh. By the way, I'm listed in the program as a board member of the Center for Studies of Islam in the Middle East, and that's true, but my comments are purely personal. The questions that you had asked me earlier, there's 3 of them, but the first one, what is Iran's appetite to cooperate with neighbors and others? I'm not at all familiar with other countries in the Gulf area, but I have some experience with Iran and also the scientific information exchanges that were held between the US and the Iran national in Iran, it's called Farhangistan, National Academies of Science. These, over a period of years ending in 2017, there were some 30 of these exchanges, and they had workshops and other programs, and they were extremely successful on a number of different subjects, and very popular with both the Iranians and the American scientists. By the way, Iranian scientists are absolutely top drawer, and the Americans learned an awful lot from their Iranian counterparts. Those programs stopped after 2017, but I was in Iran in July of 2017 at a conference, the Sand and Dust Storm Conference. And in my comments, I mentioned how much the American scientists had appreciated the contacts and the exchanges with their Iranian counterparts, and hoped that this could be continued in the future. And after the conference, after my comments, I had 3 deputy ministers come up and congratulate me and a number of Iranian academics. So what this tells me, and of course I have ongoing contacts, but this tells me that there's a great appetite amongst the Iranian scientific community, the non-political, if you wish, in exchanges certainly with scientists of the United States and other areas.
Thank you. David, tell us a little bit more about, if you could, the big picture overview as well, from your experience on environmental challenges facing Iran. I mean, you could go in any direction you want, but what do you think Iran's most imminent environmental challenges are?
Well, if you go to areas like the Hormuz wetlands in eastern Iran, where people are water challenged, you might say, and you talk with local individuals, both the government officials and the stakeholders of local farmers and so forth, and they'll say that our problem is not quantity of water, our problem is management. And that's what it all boils down to. And in my opinion, Iran has an overly large population of some 80 million people. It's hard to feed and take care of those people. And but it has considerable water resources compared to other countries in the Middle East. Iran has a great deal, but the problem is management. And as to what the United States can do to help, and webinars like this, I think, are very helpful. You know, the objective and constructive information. If the United States were to remove sanctions, that would help a great deal. As Kaveh has pointed out, these sanctions are indirectly, but greatly aggravate environmental damage. And then the U.S. could also support, for example, the World Bank group. This group, this IMF, the World Bank itself, and the Global Environmental Fund, has not been able to start any new programs in Iran since 2005 because of the threatened vetoes by the United States. And the bank itself, of course, finances infrastructure together with technical assistance. And the Global Environmental Fund has at one point been very, very helpful in terms of funding projects addressing global warming issues. There are other things that could be done. The scientific information exchanges, I think right now, are probably not feasible for political reasons until such time as the United States and Iran perhaps revive diplomatic relations. But the US could give more support to the United Nations agencies. They have permanent staff in Iran, cultural Iranians, who are therefore obviously culturally competent and know how to deal with government officials and local people. You have the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, which has both its small grants program. This is implemented some 270 programs since 2001, dealing with biodiversity, capacity development, climate change, international waters, land degradation. UNDP itself, the major studies on Lake Urmia, the Hormuz. They've funded conferences, study groups, and they've done some very important joint ventures with the Department of the Environment. There's the CACP, Conservation of Asiatic Cheetahs Program, which is a joint venture between the UNDP, Department of the Environment, and a consulting from the American. Originally, it was the Wildlife Conservation Society, but that morphed into Pantera, an American NGO that deals with conservation of cats around the world. And this CACP program is largely responsible for the fact that cheetahs are still alive in Iran. Then there's the CIWP, which is the Conservation of the Iranian Wetlands Program. And this deals with integrated wetlands management. And they've worked with some 34 wetlands to date. They have people going, consultants going to local areas, staying there, living with the local people, helping them with better irrigation practices and better agricultural crop choices. It's been very successful. The Japanese have invested over $2 million in that program. The DOE, by the way, the Department of the Environment, is a huge, it's not a ministry, but it combines all the functions of the American EPA, Fish and Wildlife, and also is responsible for management of some 264 wildlife parks and monuments, and which comprise more than 10% of Iran's landmass. It's terribly underfunded and has very little authority, but a lot of dedicated people. And it would, I think, very much like to cooperate with other countries that have a lot of experience in land, water, wildlife management. And UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, is another very major agency of the United Nations that's done a lot of work with sand and dust storms and pollution issues, funding conferences and workshops, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, David. I will now turn back to Kaveh. Kaveh, I want to come back to you, but not maybe this round, but the issue of US sanctions is something that we should really get to at some point, impact of, and where the US could potentially, be flexible in terms of the implementations of the sanctions and carry them out in a way that perhaps is not going to be making the environmental situation in Iran and Persian Gulf region any worse. And that's something I wanted to come back to. But David also mentioned something else that really I think a lot of us are interested in, and that goes to the issue of policy making and a management issue in Iran and the Islamic Republic. If you read the news, Kaveh, you're the expert, but those of us who are not the experts in this field, we watch this and we go, one day there's news that they're going to pipe in water from the Caspian up in the north to the central provinces. But the last few years, you've seen a tendency to talk about desalination and bringing water from the Gulf of Oman up to the central provinces in Iran. Then you got the issue of who's running the management. If the issue with the dam making in Iran is anything go by, this is a very kind of contested policymaking area. Who runs the show when it comes to water security? Is it one part of the government or another part of the system that runs it? So management, I guess, is one of those issues where there's quite a number of question marks around. I just wanted to give you a sense. Do you see the management to sort of be in sync in Tehran? I mean, can you describe water policy in Iran today as one that is coordinated, nicely implemented? They know what they want. There's a long-term vision. Or are they just trying to figure out, based on protests by farmers in Yazd province or Semnan or somewhere, then the government reacts. There's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction, but it doesn't usually go anywhere. What's your take about the issue of management and how policy has been implemented?
Nowhere in the world, including the United States and Iran, water, management of water is well integrated. So nowhere in the world. The issue that we have is most of the times the roots and causes of the problems in the water and environmental sector are out of the boundaries of the water sector. But those who manage the water sector have no say there. So they don't decide about the population growth policies. They don't decide on where to place people. They don't decide on foreign policy, and development plans and so many other things. So what they need to do and they're asked to do is to keep up with the growing demand and provide water wherever is needed. So then those in the water sector becomes water suppliers. When they become water suppliers, of course, they ask people to conserve, and they do campaigns and they try to adjust the price and so many other things. But most of the times in most places around the world, it's the physical limits which at the end determines the hydrologic carrying capacity. And then when we are water short, then we go after bringing water from other regions. Now, yes, we are hearing this, and Iran is now very ambitiously pursuing water transfer plans and implementing projects, which would desalinate water from the Gulf, the Sea of Oman and Persian Gulf and move water for kilometers. This is ambitious. This is, this has a lot of environmental consequences. But the typical response, and I think an hour ago I tweeted about this in Persian and said this is a political economy problem, because someone had compared the cost of transferring water to central Iran versus the cost of just buying out the illegal wells and shutting them down and just operating in central Iran with the available water, and couldn't find out why they didn't pick the cheaper option, which was shutting down the illegal wells. So when I said this is a political economy problem, the typical response that we get from a lot of people is, look, the Arabs on the other side of the Persian Gulf are just desalinating water and taking the water out, and they just release the brine, and they're into the Persian Gulf. Why shouldn't we do it? And this becomes also a kind of competition. I don't agree that the countries in south of the Persian Gulf are only having the option of desalination. Of course, desalination can be part of their portfolio, but we have countries like Oman doing agriculture at the coast. Just in the coast of Oman, we are seeing unsustainable agriculture that can be shut down. In other countries, we also have wasteful uses of water. So even if desalination is going to be in the portfolio of the countries in that part of the world, there must be a control and checks and balances on the demand side. So we don't have a coordinated plan. Then add to this the issue of political economy, which I just mentioned. We need to create jobs and maintain jobs, and and that's what they see. Then the phobia of what food insecurity, what they Iranians have seen, Saddam Hussein have seen, recent Qatar's problems with food security and food insecurity, that phobia, and then also we have corruption, we have mismanagement, and so many other things. So technocrats take over, and all they can think of is technology, desalinate, move water around, and so many other things, and that's what we see now. On the question that you had about cooperation in on the Persian Gulf, we have RAPMI, which is like traditionally we used to call it a Kuwait convention, for protection of marine resources in the Persian Gulf, and that brings together all 8 countries. There are discussions there are conferences, and countries, despite all these political problems they have been meeting each other, but not much else is happening. Plus you cannot again disaggregate the environmental sector from all other sectors and expect the countries, to sit down together and at the same table and start thinking about solving the problem. So this is another mistake that we make. So environment can be part of a bigger package of cooperation in the region, and indeed it's a good starting point for cooperation. Iran and Afghanistan are negotiating over Hirmand and Helmand water and protection of the Hormuz, but the water negotiations are happening as part of a bigger negotiations, which includes like 7-8 working groups, which talk about different aspects and different dimensions of cooperation. So there, then you can include water, but then also when it comes to the responsibility of the global players and what they can do, let's not forget that this region is providing oil to the whole world. And forget desalination, forget what is happening locally. The whole shipping industry and all these big big vessels, marine vessels, which are there, are creating pollution. Oil and gas industry is creating a lot of pollution, damaging the resources of the Persian Gulf, and not much is happening. We don't see big meetings around the world about the Persian Gulf and actions and different statements on the need to fight. We also see that the tensions in the region, the wars, the years of terrorism, and all these things are adding to the problems of the region, and no one is thinking much about them, and no relief packages are offered, even concerns are expressed. If Iran decides to do something, and I think we should all blame, as Iranians, we have the right to blame Iran, and others also can criticize Iran's and Tehran's decisions on different things that it's doing to the environment. Well, we don't see a fair game. If the United Arab Emirates decides to build islands in the Persian Gulf, we don't see much criticisms. If Qatar is deciding to do something else, if Saudi Arabia is doing different things, we don't see that sort of coverage. Iran is a heated place. It's a region that we pay a lot of attention to, and then we come up with all these narratives. And a lot of times we don't even provide the solution. So as I said, environment has become a sector for expression of concerns. You see Benjamin, Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu talking about Iran's water. We saw the previous administration many times expressing concerns about Iran's environment and water, while at the same time we are seeing a ban on any sort of financial aid to Iran, which is related to the environmental sector. And I think we can discuss that under the sanctions topic.
Sure, thank you, Kab. I'll come back to you on the sanctions. Then we have a question for you from the audience, whether you could comment on the management of the byproduct of desalination, brine basically, and how it connects to climate change in the Persian Gulf. I mean, the issue I guess is well, I think I read what the issue is. What's the management like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the more we have desalination activities, the more we have brine being discharged into the Gulf. And then what happens is, as the water becomes more and the salinity increases in the water, the desalination operations become less efficient. And so now we require more energy to desalinate the same amount of water than previously. And this is continuously growing and growing. So this is a good concern to bring up, is that we at some point are going to reach a point where it's really, really it's already a very energy intensive operation, desalination, and it's becoming more and more and more energy intensive as the salinity of the water increases. And the issue with the Gulf being such a small body of water and also very semi-enclosed, it takes years for a particle of water to actually leave the Gulf. The cycle of life of a particle of water is anywhere between 2 to 4 years, but until it leaves the Gulf. So it can be considered like a closed body of water, because there isn't really water cycling in and out of this Gulf very quickly. And so it is a concern. It's a growing concern. As we increase our desalination activities, it will continue to become a growing concern, and is something that, hopefully we can find a solution to, because the constant depositing of this brine into the Gulf is creating an environmental concern and energy concern.
And while I have you, before I turn to David, 2 other questions. I want to make sure I get to go through as many questions as I can. Just 2 quick comments from you. I don't know what you make of this question. Why not use solar for desalination? You can tell me if that's a feasible option. Why not use solar? And the other question that we had is, what are the sort of economic logics to go for a desalination nuclear power plants that are expensive to operate as opposed to alternatives?
Yes. So on the first question with regards to solar, the issue there is the reliability. So when it comes to, for example, nuclear power, it can run pretty much at capacity 90% of the time on average, whereas solar power, its capacity is much lower at maybe 20%. And so meaning that when we need a reliable source of energy, we can't be depending on solar because solar fluctuates depending on the weather, the clouds in the sky, and so on. And so even though solar is technically a good option in terms of reliability, especially when you're trying to provide energy to an industry that needs energy constantly and reliably, it's much more difficult to depend on solar. There are efforts to introduce solar into the mix, but it can't be fully 100% depended on because of the fluctuation in solar power. The second question was about the economical feasibility, I think, of the reactors. Back in 2000 and around 2010, when UAE did the study to predict their future demand, and they realized that their current energy supplies would not be able to meet demand, they needed again to look for a reliable source of energy to diversify their economy and meet this additional demand. And when they did their studies, they looked at different types of energy and so on. And in terms of reliability and cost, at the time in 2010, that was the better outcome in terms of both efficiency, reliability, cost, and so on. And that's why they went with that decision. Now in 2020, 2021, these numbers might be different in other sectors, but at that time, that's the decision that was made based on the data, the cost at that point in time. They are also trying to introduce solar power and other energies, but again, reliability is the main concern.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And David, turning to you, a quick question here. I don't know if this is one for you, but I did want you to at least maybe give it a go. And then I had my own main question. The question asks, what about Iran's historical qanats, the water, the traditional water irrigation system, the qanats? What's the situation with them? Are they still in? I don't know if that's something for you. Maybe Kaveh can comment on it.
I've been experiencing qanats since 1959 when I first went to Iran, and they are wonderful and they're extremely efficient. And Kaveh, of course, is technically much more competent to describe them than I. I think there's still some 25,000 or so functioning in Iran, and I've still in the last 10 years been to a couple places where they depend on qanat water, and it's wonderful. It solves so many problems, and but I would turn the discussion over to Kaveh on that subject. He is much more competent than I.
Okay, we'll get to Kaveh on qanat. I will not forget Kaveh, but since I have you and we have about 10 minutes, I wanted to ask you broadly, David. I really think it's important that we ask you this question since you've had so much of experience in this field on issue of exchange of scientific information, data, know-how among regional states. And you don't need to limit yourself to this region, but just broadly from what you know, what you've seen or you read. What are the issues? I mean, what are the benefits of scientific cooperation in a field like this? Take the water issue in the Persian Gulf region, just as an example. What are the benefits? I mean, I think everyone heard what the benefits are. I mean, some of the things Kaveh was describing to me for a second sounded like race to the bottom. We all go on our own way, and this is a zero-sum game mentality, which is very true for the politics of the region. But when everybody, as Rena's article pointed out, everybody depends on the health, I should say, of the Gulf region, then the idea of everybody just on their own and racing down to the bottom just seems like a collective damaging themselves, to put it mildly. But anyway, back, David, to the issue of scientific exchange of data. You've seen that firsthand in Iran, but if you had to give us any insights into where the US could come in, since you mentioned the sanctions, and help some of that, how can the United States play a constructive role involving not just the Gulf states that are allies of the United States, but also Iran, a country that, again, as Kaveh pointed out, has not had good relations with the US since 1979. Is there a way for the US?
Well, of course there is, and it would start with enabling the World Bank Group and releasing sanctions, et cetera, as I mentioned earlier. Iran, you've got to remember, is very sensitive to perceived influences from the US and other Western countries with respect to spying and impose Western development programs. And so the United States has to be very careful how it relates to these issues. One thing to remember in Iran is that Iran has wonderful scientists, but they're not trained in actual program work. They're theoretical scientists, and so there's not much cooperation between government and the academic side and the private sector, and so this is an issue. We here in this country, our universities, even in the United States now, are much more oriented towards research and not towards practical applications, so forth. And this is something that Iran can benefit from, working with other countries. But as I said, it's a politically sensitive thing. I have some experience because of the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation, with which I was connected, that they did a tremendous amount of beneficial work for Iran, all pro bono. Mm-hmm. And this was very suspicious. Why would anybody do something for free? And I spent a lot of time wandering around in desert areas and so forth, staying with game guards at their guard houses and so forth. So there was no record of my having been there. And when the secret police found out about that, they said, "Oh my God, what's this American speaking Farsi doing? He's either making a lot of money, which clearly you don't make in the desert, or he's a spy." And so my point is that NGOs are extremely important in Iran. They perform functions that the government cannot. And they, by nature of their work, they coordinate with foreign entities with respect to technology and other issues. But they have to be very, very careful and coordinate their activities with all government agencies. My friends were arrested at the end of 2017. They're still in prison, and I am still considered a spy.
Thanks, David. Kaveh, turning to you, we have about just under 10 minutes. If you wanted to say anything about the qanat, since the question came up, please do. And then I have a question here that I need to read. So let me read this for you, and then we can maybe, if there's even time, go to the sanction issue. The question is, having a similar geology on both sides of the Persian Gulf, being rich in alluvium, I hope to pronounce that right, have the southern states, the Arab Gulf states, have they considered groundwater recharge through managing flash floods to store water for future generations? And the same question points out, in Iran, watershed managers have been able to store flood water in aquifers in the Zagros region, alluvial fans. And I pronounced it, I'm sure, wrongly, but there you go. Please, Kaveh.
I don't have complete information about all the countries, but I have worked in Oman, and Oman is doing that. So it is a a way of storing water, and I think countries consider that when it works. Now, a few things, on the qanats are wonderful. They haven't received as much attention as the Roman aqueducts have received. I think the Persians, the Middle Easterns, because they all have qanats, they have to promote that further and further and show that let the world benefit from them, because they're a sustainable method of groundwater withdrawal. Yet the current level of groundwater in Iran has dried up, a lot of qanats, because they were dug when the water level was somewhere else. And then when we adopted the Western technology and pumps, and we learned how to dig wells and make them deeper, we lost qanats. And then Iran's population, as well as the rest of the Middle East, are not comparable to what it was before. Before the revolution, Iran had 35 million people. Within 2 decades after the revolution, the population got doubled. And now we're talking about more than 80 million people. You cannot manage Iran with, supply water to Iran with qanats only. Qanats can be part of the portfolio. On two other things, on making creating solar desalination plant. Desalination is not a sustainable technology. Now you add solar to it, you lose part of your guilt, but it doesn't make that you have made the whole thing sustainable. It's like electric cars. We don't see the smoke. We think we are using a more sustainable technology. Now the issue is, like, if you can't give up on driving to your meeting or to work and using bicycles or public transport, then you're making a change. But if you're just moving the pollution from your city to somewhere in East Asia and killing people there, then you're not doing much good. So it's about like greenwashing. Nuclear, when it comes to comparing nuclear with the other alternative energies in the region, actually in the Middle East, based on the available resources, indeed nuclear becomes one of the top performers and top choices based on its water footprint, carbon footprint, cost, and land footprint, and the available resources in the region for all the countries. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that nuclear is risk-free. What makes nuclear prohibitive and why we don't like it is because the risk associated with it. We still can't trust nuclear, and what the long-term consequences are questionable. On the issue of cooperation and what the U.S. can do. Now, U.S. can start from, we don't want the U.S. to do things proactively. U.S. can start from getting rid of the barriers it has created for the scientific exchanges between the two countries. Academics get along. Iranian academics and the Arab academics have been talking, and they continue to do so. The Iranians and the Americans have been conversing, and they continue to do so. They publish papers together, they exchange information. And what we have right now are barriers, actually, that have been created. Iranian students cannot go on Coursera and watch a course and download it, just attend the course. The Iranians are banned from, like, University of California, for example, in some recent meetings, cited sanctions and said Iranians cannot attend the Zoom meeting because Zoom is under sanctions, like tech transfer and lots of other things. And some of us who have worked in academic environments in the US also have been questioned by export control experts who have questioned the legitimacy of our actions and have argued that we are pumping knowledge to Iran, and that is against the sanctions. So US can start from lifting those barriers, giving visas to the students, let the academics travel between the two countries, and once trust is built, then they can go to the next level. If you're putting your knee on someone's neck and that person cannot breathe, you cannot tell that, at the same time, if you're putting your knee on my neck and I can't breathe, and you tell me that, by the way, you must be using a better shampoo, you're losing your hair and I like your hair, I can't trust you. So if you're putting sanctions on me, you're banning, you're not letting money be transferred to Iran, then you're saying something about Iran's cheetahs, then the Iranians don't question the legitimacy of your concern. And that is I think a natural reaction. Now, on the issue of sanctions is that's a heated discussion. It's a heated debate. Sanctions must not be used to justify Iran's environmental problems. Sanctions have not caused Iran's environmental problems. Sanctions are not like climate change. They are catalysts for the problem. So Iran was going down the path. It was making its environment worse because of lack of foresight, years of bad development plans. Now sanctions have been added and is catalyzing the problem. Why? Because it's making the country more dependent on its natural resources. When my economy goes down, if I cannot create jobs in different sectors, what do? I sell my oil at a cheaper price. I won't stop digging oil, taking oil out. I mine more, I sell my natural resources because I want to stand on my own feet and survive. So Iran goes into the survival mode and it uses more natural resources. When you impose sanctions on its oil and gas industry, Iran will not, or put a ban on gasoline import exports to Iran, Iran will not stop producing gasoline or using cars. It will produce gasoline at the cheaper price, and with the lower, with the lower quality, and gives it to people. So what happens is that the environmental situation gets worse, and the priorities of the countries would be different. COVID-19 now is overshadowing the climate change discussions, because when the world is suffering from something big, it doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with environmental problems. The same applies to Iran. So we have to be very careful about what we claim about sanctions, but sanctions have stopped some of the, international financial aid to Iran, as David pointed out. It has stopped exchanges. A lot of times Iran couldn't buy some technologies, but Iran at the same time has developed, its missiles, and it's has made a lot of progress in the defense sector, in the military sector. So if it had the desire to do the same thing for the environment, it could have managed the environmental sector. But the priorities change, and Iran doesn't put the environment above many other things, and its ideology, and the Islamic Republic would pursue the things that it has been fighting for, and environment becomes just a victim of this game of imposing sanctions and escaping from their pressure. So what can be done is another step. We know that there are exemptions, and there are some when it comes to food and medicine. Environment, though, is not part of the game, and that is surprising. Environment can be added as even if sanctions are not going to be lifted, in the environmental sector can be, can receive an exemption, and some help can be provided there. Why? Because the implications of the environmental implications of the sanctions, even if they're unintended, and they are intergenerational and transboundary. So they would last forever. Even if Iran and the US tomorrow, shake hands tomorrow and get rid of all the sanctions are lifted, and the two countries start talking to each other forever, and they're friends for the rest of their lives, the environmental problems that have been created would not go away. And those problems would, the next generations in the region would suffer from them. Iran's neighbors would suffer from them, as Iran has been suffering from problems in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East, which have been under war and tensions and so on. Because of that element, and because access to clean water and environment is a human right, we have to do something, and the US and the whole world has to be doing something about this sector, both condemning, Iran's lack of action, and the rest of the Middle Eastern countries' lack of action on the environmental sector, plus doing more for the environment and making sure that the Iranians, as well as the rest of the people in the region, can, have their rights, environmental rights, and their human rights respected.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, but I do want to give Rena and David a last chance to say what else they might have on their minds. Actually, Rena, in your case, I also have a question. I don't know if it's a fair question. It's a big question, but the questioner asks, give us your best versus worst case scenario for food security in the Gulf region. And, I want to remind everyone what you put out in your paper, a 30% increase in population in 20 years. That's a big number. So what is the best case? What's the worst case scenario in terms of, water and food security?
I would say the best case is that nothing happens. There's no problems. Ideally, we're all talking, we're all on the same table, we're having conversations environmentally, policy-wise, with researchers, the scientists at the table, and really making decisions collectively. That's the ideal best case. And then the worst case is not being prepared, and an incident at the scale of Fukushima or at the scale of BP Deepwater Horizon or something of that scale happening in the region, and us not having a game plan. So that's the worst case that I hope we do not ever get to, but that is the worst case scenario.
Rena and David, Rena said something that is real, something to fear in reality, but I'm hoping you can take me in a different direction based on the experiences. Give us a positive ending here, if you don't mind. What can go right in terms of cooperation in the field of the environment? And by all means, do build on what Kaveh was saying about US sanctions, the role of those sanctions, and possible alternative paths going forward. But I'm hoping, David, that you can give us something to sort of hope for.
A sort of sine qua non, if you like, is that Western countries, especially the United States, have got to become more culturally competent in dealing in the Middle East. Water, for example, Kaveh was saying that it's a human right. When in Iran, it is considered that. In other countries, it's a economic or even an environmental issue, but not necessarily a human right. If we're going to function with the Iranians and function in Iran, we have to understand them and their culture a lot better than we do right now. Of course, not having an embassy since 1979 plays a role, but that's not the only excuse, if you like.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rena. Thank you, Kaveh. Thank you for your time coming today for this panel. It's really lots of good insights. I learned a lot. As someone who's been covering the Middle East for the last 20 years, we're busy with so much else going on in that part of the world, the politics of it, that you kind of forget something as important as the role of the environment, because it can have an impact across societies on all levels, an area we need to learn more about. And certainly at the Middle East Institute, our intention going forward the rest of the years and hopefully years to come is to start identifying not just only issues that ought to be of concern to countries of the region, but also hopefully bring the experts like your good selves on board, build on this, and also come up with possible solutions going forward, because that's what the region deserves. And I hope the United States also will get involved more. I know the US wants to help as much as it can on that front, and hopefully we'll see more of that sort of a cooperation on a pan-regional level going forward. But that's all the time we have for today. I thank you all very much for dialing in, for your questions, and have a great day. Stay safe until next time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.